May the 12th, 1968. The helicopter blades beat against humid air 40 kilometers northeast of Saigon as Australian soldiers descended into hell. They had no idea that within hours the earth beneath their boots would run red with blood. They had no idea that the North Vietnamese army was watching them from the shadows. They had no idea they were landing directly on top of an enemy division headquarters. Before you dive into this story of Australia's bloodiest battle in Vietnam, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Vietnam War records. You won't want to miss what happens next, because what unfolded over the next 26 days would become the largest, longest, and most savage battle Australian forces ever fought in the Vietnam War. This is the story of how 2,500 Australians stopped 4,000 North Vietnamese regulars in their tracks. This is the Battle of Coral-Balmoral. The morning sun rose over fire support base Coral like a copper coin through the smoke. But this was not a normal dawn. The night before, the earth had trembled with explosions. The air had screamed. Men had died in the dark, fighting hand-to-hand over gun pits and mortar tubes. And now, as the light crept across the rubber plantation revealing the carnage, the Australians understood with cold clarity that everything they had been told was a lie. They had been told the enemy was withdrawing. They had been told the North Vietnamese were demoralized, broken, fleeing in small, scattered groups. They had been told there was no serious threat, but 52 enemy bodies lay twisted and bloodied around the perimeter wire. The Australian mortar platoon had been overrun. One of the howitzers had been captured in brutal close-quarters combat. 9 Australians were dead. 28 were wounded. And somewhere out there in the jungle to the east, an entire enemy division was regrouping for another attack. To understand how this nightmare began, you must go back 3 months. Back to the Tet Offensive. January 31st, 1968. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong launched the largest coordinated offensive of the entire war, striking over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam simultaneously. It was a tactical disaster for the Communists. They lost 45,000 men in a matter of weeks. The Viet Cong were gutted, losing half their strength. But Hanoi understood something the Americans did not. Wars are not won by body counts alone. They are won in the minds of politicians and the hearts of citizens back home. And when the American public saw enemy soldiers storming the U.S. Embassy in Saigon on their television screens, confidence in the war collapsed. President Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The anti-war movement exploded. Politically, Tet was a North Vietnamese victory, even as their soldiers died by the thousands. But General Vo Nguyen Giap was not finished. He had lost the Viet Cong infrastructure, so he replaced them. By early May 1968, 15,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars had infiltrated south to reinforce the shattered VC units. Fresh troops, well-trained, well-equipped, determined. And they were massing around Saigon for another strike. The Americans called it the May Offensive, the Mini Tet. On May 5th, the North Vietnamese attacked 119 targets, including the South Vietnamese capital itself. 5 enemy battalions penetrated Saigon's outer defenses. The city plunged into chaos, street fighting, civilian casualties, international media covering every brutal moment. For 3 days the battle raged. Then the Communists were thrown back with devastating losses. Over 5,500 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were killed in and around Saigon in just over a week. But the Americans paid dearly too. 652 killed, over 2,200 were wounded. It was the bloodiest week of the war for U.S. forces. By May 12th, the fighting in Saigon was over. The North Vietnamese were withdrawing, and that is when the Australians were called in. Brigadier Ron Hughes commanded the 1st Australian Task Force, known as 1ATF. His headquarters sat at Nui Dat in Phuoc Thu Province, where for over a year, the Australians had been conducting their own brand of counterinsurgency warfare. They did not fight like the Americans. The U.S. doctrine relied on massive firepower and large-scale search-and-destroy operations, overwhelming force, artillery, airstrikes, attrition. The Australians were different. They emphasized patrolling, ambushes, small unit tactics, intelligence gathering. They studied the British experience in Malaya. They adapted. They learned the jungle, and they were effective. But now Hughes received orders from the American IIA Field Force Vietnam commander, Lieutenant General Frederick Wyand. 1ATF was to redeploy north, far from their familiar area of operations, into Bien Hoa. Their mission was simple in concept but brutal in execution. Establish blocking positions astride Route 16, interdict enemy withdrawal routes from Saigon, find the North Vietnamese army and stop them from escaping back to their base areas in War Zone D and across the Cambodian border. On May 10th, Brigadier Hughes attended an orders group at II Field Force headquarters. He was given a new area of operations. They called it AO Surfers. It was 40 kilometers northeast of Saigon, just east of the town of Lai Khe in Binh Duong province. A dangerous place. Enemy territory. And Hughes was told that intelligence indicated North Vietnamese forces were in the area. Formed units, not scattered remnants. But when Hughes briefed his battalion commanders, something got lost in the translation. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Bennett commanded 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, known as 1R. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Shelton commanded 3rd Battalion 3RA. Both men were experienced, capable officers, but the orders they received verbally on the night of May 10th painted a very different picture than reality. They were told the enemy was withdrawing in small groups, low morale, disorganized. No significant threat. It was a catastrophic intelligence failure. Because 9 kilometers east of where they were about to land, the headquarters of the North Vietnamese 7th Division was dug in and waiting. 2 full regiments, the 141st and the 165th, thousands of hardened soldiers. And they were not withdrawing. They were preparing to attack. The helicopter assault into fire support base Coral began at 0740 on May 12th. It was supposed to be a textbook operation. Secure the landing zone. Fly in the artillery batteries. Establish the fire support base. Deploy the infantry battalions into their patrol areas. Simple. But within minutes, everything began to go wrong. The original landing zone was compromised. American forces from the 1st Infantry Division were in heavy contact with the enemy just 3 kilometers to the west. Helicopters could not land under fire. A new LZ had to be designated 1,000 meters to the southwest, but nobody told the reconnaissance parties. Confusion rippled through the operation like a shockwave. The artillery officers expected to land together, select battery positions in coordination, establish a unified defensive perimeter. Instead, the New Zealand gunners from 161st Field Battery arrived by Chinook helicopter before anyone was ready. They landed in an improvised clearing with no designated gun positions, no defensive plan, no coordination. The Australian 102nd Field Battery Reconnaissance Party landed at yet another location, and the officer responsible for coordinating the defense, Major Brian Murtaugh, the second-in-command of 12th Field Regiment, made a decision that would nearly cost the task force everything. He positioned the 2 artillery batteries 1,500 meters apart. 1,500 meters. They should have been adjacent, mutually supporting. Instead, they were isolated, vulnerable, separated by rubber plantation and open ground. The fly-in continued in chaos throughout the day. Companies from 3RA landed but could not move to their planned positions because American forces were still fighting in their area of operations. 1RRR was delayed for hours waiting for helicopters. The mortar platoon from 1RA, 18 men with their heavy 81mm tubes, did not arrive until 17:20 hours, just over 2 hours before dark. And when they landed, they were placed in the worst possible position, on the perimeter, adjacent to the guns of 102 Battery, exposed, isolated. They were not behind defensive positions. They were not protected by infantry. They were the front line, and there was no time to dig proper defenses. Weapon pits were scraped out, but many were only 15 centimeters deep, barely scratches in the earth. There was no barbed wire because the wire had not arrived. There were no claymore mines because nobody knew where the infantry companies were positioned in the darkness. There was no overhead protection, no sandbags, no coordination. The Australians had flown into a hornet's nest, and they were scattered across 5 kilometers of enemy-controlled territory in 4 disconnected groups, with incomplete defenses as night fell. But they did not know that less than 300 meters away in the rubber trees to the northeast, North Vietnamese soldiers were digging in. Hundreds of them, battalion strength. They had watched the entire Australian insertion. They had counted the helicopters. They had observed the gun positions They had noted the confusion, the delays, the lack of coordination. And the divisional commander of the NVA 7th Division, Win the Bon, made a bold decision. He would not wait. He would not let the Australians consolidate their defenses. He would strike that very night. 1 battalion of the 141st Regiment, augmented by the 275th and 269th infiltration groups, fresh troops who had just completed the march down the Ho Chi Minh Trail from North Vietnam 48 hours earlier. They would attack fire support base Coral in overwhelming strength, under cover of darkness, and they would destroy the exposed Australian artillery before dawn. As darkness fell, the Australian infantrymen stood to. It was standard procedure. Everyone stops working. Everyone watches their front, silent, alert, waiting for any sign of enemy movement. But the night was not silent at Coral. The guns continued firing missions in support of the rifle companies deploying into ambush positions kilometers away. The crash of 105mm howitzers shattered the darkness every few minutes, and then shortly after midnight, the first contact came. The mortar platoon machine gunner opened fire on 3 North Vietnamese soldiers moving at the edge of the position. Stand to was ordered. Everyone grabbed weapons. The enemy returned fire with a machine gun. Green tracer rounds streaked. The Australian Regimental Command Post accused the mortar platoon of firing at them. The response came back immediately. "We only have red tracer. That is green. That is enemy." The contact broke off. Stand down was ordered. Most of the gunners and mortar men went back to sleep. The machine gun sentries resumed their watch. The night settled into an uneasy quiet. At 02:15 hours, a radio call crackled through the fire support base. D Company 1RA, positioned in ambush 2,000 meters to the north, had contacted a group of enemy moving southwest toward Coral. The company machine gunner opened fire. The response was instant and rocket-propelled grenades exploded in the trees above the Australian positions. 11 men from one platoon became casualties in seconds. The forward observer with the company, Second Lieutenant Gordon Alexander, called in a fire mission. Contact! Contact! Fire mission battery. The call roared out over the tannoy speaker system at 102 battery. Gunners tumbled out of their weapon pits. They wrestled the 2.2-ton howitzers around to the north. They began slamming 105mm high explosive shells downrange in support of the beleaguered infantry company. 20 minutes later, the mission ended. The target was recorded as a defensive fire task, but the battery commander, Major Gavin Andrews, was worried. He asked his gun position officer, Lieutenant Ian Hearn, if the battery could handle 2 final protective fire tasks simultaneously. 2 FPF missions. It meant splitting the guns. 3 guns laid to the east in support of B Company. 3 guns laid to the north in support of D Company. Ahern agreed. Guns 1, 2, and 3 were oriented east. Guns 4, 5, and 6 were oriented north. It was a decision born of concern for the infantry, but it would prove to be the stroke of luck that saved fire support base Coral from annihilation. At 03:30 hours, the world exploded. Rocket-propelled grenades shrieked out of the darkness. Mortar rounds slammed into the battery and mortar positions. Heavy machine gun fire raked the perimeter. The bombardment was intense, concentrated, devastating. For 5 minutes, the fire poured in. Then there was a 10-minute pause, silence, and then flares arced into the sky from the northeast. The signal. The assault began. Gunners Mick Grimes and John Schwartzy were manning the machine gun in front of number 6 gun. They could not believe their eyes. Out of the darkness at no more than 150 meters, massed ranks of North Vietnamese infantry simply stood up and came forward. Lines of men, scores of them, firing AK-47 assault rifles, moving fast. Grimes opened fire with the M60 machine gun. The weapon jammed. He cleared it, fired again, jammed again. They fell back to the gun platform. The enemy followed them right up onto the protective earth bund around the gun. Desperate fighting erupted. Grimes was hit in the hand by AK fire, but his self-loading rifle took the burst and saved his life. Section Commander, Second Lieutenant Matt Cleland, arrived, emptied his pistol at point-blank range into the enemy soldiers on the bund, then sprinted back to his weapon pit to grab his F-1 submachine gun. The North Vietnamese assault crashed into the mortar platoon position like a tidal wave. The 18 men of the platoon were overwhelmed in seconds. Hand-to-hand combat. Grenades. Small arms fire at arm's length. 5 men were killed instantly. 8 more were wounded. The platoon was overrun, shattered, and the enemy swept through the position directly toward the gun line of 102 battery. But those guns were ready. The crews had been alerted by the preparatory bomb, and the 3 northern guns, 4, 5, and 6, were already laid directly at the assault axis. The gun captains did not hesitate. They loaded flechette rounds. beehive rounds. Each shell contained thousands of steel darts, 1 inch long, designed to turn the gun into a giant shotgun. When they fired those rounds over open sights at ranges of 50 to 100 meters, the result was apocalyptic. Entire ranks of attacking soldiers were scythed down. The steel darts ripped through flesh and bone with horrific efficiency. Bodies were torn apart. The assault waves shattered into small groups. Some hesitated at the edge of the mortar position. Others tried to push through between the mortars and the artillery. But the Australian gunners kept firing, and when they ran out of flechette rounds, they improvised. They depressed the barrels and fired high explosive shells at the ground, 40 to 50 meters in front of the gun positions. The rounds hit, skipped forward, and exploded in the air above the heads of the attacking force. It was lethal, effective, brutal. But the North Vietnamese had achieved penetration. They were inside the perimeter, and on the left flank, they overran. The gun crew fell back to number 5 gun. The enemy swarmed and they attempted to turn it against the Australians. They tried to destroy it with satchel charges but could not because the gun sergeant, Max Franklin, had taken the firing pin with him when he withdrew. In the mortar position, the second-in-command, Lieutenant Tony Jensen, made a terrible decision, a necessary decision. He called for recoilless rifle fire onto his own position. The 90mm recoilless rifles from the 1 Ra anti-tank platoon were positioned 300 meters away. They were loaded with flechette rounds. Jensen knew that if he did not call fire onto the mortar position immediately, the entire battery would be lost. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Bennett, the battalion commander, approved the mission. Thousands of darts swept across the mortar position. Everything above ground level. North Vietnamese soldiers were cut down. Australian mortar tubes were damaged by the darts, but the enemy advance was stopped cold. The battle raged for over an hour. The Australians were supported by artillery from neighboring American batteries. Helicopter gunships strafed the enemy with minigun fire. A C-47 Spooky gunships dropped continuous flares to illuminate the battlefield and poured thousands of rounds into the attacking forces. Forward observers adjusted artillery fire to within 20 meters of the Australian positions. The combined firepower was overwhelming. By 0430 hours, the main North Vietnamese attack began to falter. The enemy withdrew into the rubber plantation to the northeast, dragging their dead and wounded with them. But they left a company-sized rear guard to prevent the Australians from pursuing. At 0500, the enemy attacked again, attempting to cover the withdrawal of the main force. It was a much smaller assault, greatly reduced in strength, and it was broken up quickly by concentrated fire. At 0545, the New Zealand battery began firing on likely withdrawal routes as the pre-dawn light appeared. The Australians swept the perimeter. They found enemy soldiers hiding in weapon pits and gun emplacements. The last North Vietnamese soldier was killed in the gun position at 0610. By 0630, the evacuation of Australian casualties began by helicopter. By 0800, the enemy had completed their withdrawal. Fire support base Coral was secure, but the cost had been high. 9 Australians were dead. 28 were wounded. 1 howitzer was damaged. 2 mortars were damaged. The mortar platoon had been devastated. 72% casualty. And scattered around the perimeter were 52 North Vietnamese bodies. 23 small arms and 7 crew-served weapons were captured. Blood trails and drag marks indicated that many more enemy casualties had been removed during the withdrawal. Intelligence later confirmed that the attacking force had numbered over 300 men. The Australians had won. But it had been close, terrifyingly close. If the North Vietnamese had not launched a preparatory bombardment that alerted the defenders, the result might have been different. If the guns had not been laid by pure chance in the direction of the main assault, the artillery might have been overrun before they could respond. If the crew of number 4 gun had not stayed awake drinking coffee, there might not have been enough firepower to stop the breakthrough. The Australians had been saved by firepower, determination, and luck. But Brigadier Ron Hughes understood with absolute clarity that they had nearly suffered a catastrophic defeat. The task force headquarters itself had almost been destroyed, and the enemy watching, waiting, preparing for the next attack. Throughout May 13th, the Australians worked frantically to improve their defenses. Barbed wire was strung, claymore mines were positioned, overhead protection was constructed, weapon pits were deepened, sandbags were filled and stacked. M113 armored personnel carriers from A Squadron 3rd Cavalry Regiment arrived to reinforce the perimeter. The APCs were tracked vehicles, heavily armored, mounting 50-caliber machine guns, They provided mobile firepower and protection. Major John Keldy, the squadron commander, was appointed as the Fire Support Base Defense Commander to coordinate all defensive actions. Additional artillery arrived. American 155mm self-propelled howitzers from A Battery 2nd Battalion 35th Artillery Regiment rolled into position. Engineer teams prepared bunkers and fortifications. The defenses that should have been in place before the first night were finally being constructed, and the intelligence picture became clearer. Patrols from 1 Ra and 3 Ra clashed repeatedly with enemy forces. It was obvious now that the North Vietnamese were not withdrawing in small groups. They were concentrated, aggressive, determined. The PAVN 7th Division was operating in regimental strength, and they intended to drive the Australians out of the area. On May 14th, there were 9 separate contacts during patrol operations. 3 Australians were killed and 5 wounded. 12 North Vietnamese were confirmed killed and 2 wounded. During the afternoon, 2 platoons from 1 Ra fought separate actions within half an hour of each other. The fighting was intense, close range, desperate. 2 soldiers, Lance Corporal David Griffiths and Private Richard Norden, would be awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for their actions during these engagements. Norden's medal would later be upgraded to the Victoria Cross for Australia in 2024 following a review by the Defence Honours and Awards Tribunal. These were not chance encounters with scattered enemy. These were deliberate contacts with formed units. Reconnaissance probes. The North Vietnamese were testing the defences, learning the Australian dispositions, preparing for another assault. On May 15th, the defenders observed enemy activity close to the perimeter. Lights, flares, movement. It was a warning. The NVA 141st Regiment was massing for a second attack, and this time they would come in even greater strength. At 02:30 hours on May 16th, the sky lit up with explosions. Rocket-propelled grenades and mortar fire slammed into A Company 1 Ra, the task force headquarters, and the forward maintenance area. The barrage was heavy, concentrated, accurate. 10 minutes later, at 02:40, the assault began. A battalion-sized attack, 3 North Vietnamese companies, hundreds of soldiers. They hit A Company and B Company hard. Part of 3 Platoon A Company was overrun. The North Vietnamese penetrated the perimeter. They were inside the wire, but this time the Australian response was immediate and overwhelming. 60 guns opened fire in support, 3 batteries of 105mm field guns, 1 battery of 155mm howitzers, 1 battery of 8-inch heavy artillery, 9 81mm mortars. The volume of fire was staggering. Shells screamed overhead and impacted on enemy positions in continuous rippling explosions. 3 heavy fire teams, 9 UH-1 helicopter gunships, raked the assault waves with rockets and machine gun fire. Fighter bombers roared in with bombs and napalm. The earth shook. The air burned. The North Vietnamese attack was being pulverized by the most concentrated firepower of the entire battle, but still they came. Lieutenant Neil Weeks commanded 3 Platoon A. His position had been hit heavily by the preparatory bombardment. Several of his men were casualties, and now the North Vietnamese were pouring through a gap in the perimeter wire directly into his platoon area. Weeks did not hesitate. He ordered his men to fix bayonets. He reorganized the defense under. He called in close mortar support, bringing the rounds to within meters of his own position. The explosions tore through the attacking enemy soldiers. Bodies piled up in front of the Australian positions. Weeks held the line. For his leadership and courage under fire, he would be awarded the Military Cross. The North Vietnamese broadened their attack to include C Company. They were engaging 3 of the 4 Australian rifle companies on the perimeter simultaneously. Gaps were opened in the wire, but the enemy could not exploit them. The defensive fire was too intense, too accurate, too devastating. By 0400 hours, a company was still heavily engaged. Ammunition was running low. Helicopter light fire teams and a C-47 gunships dropped continuous flares to illuminate the battlefield. And at 0500, the main attack was finally halted. The North Vietnamese began to withdraw, but the Australians were not finished. A company was resupplied with ammunition by armored personnel carrier during the brief lull. A recoilless rifle team was pushed forward to provide additional firepower. And at 0515, the North Vietnamese attacked again. This time, they struck at the boundary between A and C companies on the northern edge of the perimeter. Mortar fire broke up the assault immediately. Then a 2-battalion attack hit A, B, and C companies from multiple directions. It was the enemy's final effort, their last attempt to achieve a breakthrough. and it was soundly defeated. The supporting fire from tanks, artillery, and mortars was so intense that the attack crumbled within minutes. The Australians counterattacked. Elements of A Company, supported by APCs, advanced and regained the section post that had been overrun in 3 platoons area. At 06:30, after 6 hours of continuous combat, the North Vietnamese broke contact and withdrew. They fought a series of rearguard actions to cover their retreat, but they were shattered, broken. The Australians began clearing the area. 4 rifle companies patrolled out to a depth of 1,000 meters. They killed 1 enemy soldier and captured another. The perimeter was lit. Blood trails led away into the jungle in every direction. 5 Australians had been killed and 19 wounded during the second attack on Coral. 2 American artillerymen were also wounded. Only 34 North Vietnamese bodies were counted on the perimeter at dawn. But intelligence reports later revealed the true scale of the enemy defeat. The attacking force had numbered 790 men. Fewer than 100 had survived unwounded. It was a catastrophic loss. The North Vietnamese 7th Division had thrown battalion and regimental-sized assaults against fire support base Coral on 2 consecutive occasions and had been repulsed both times with devastating casualties. The firepower of the combined Australian, New Zealand, and American artillery had proven decisive. The North Vietnamese could not sustain such losses. But they were not finished. They had another regiment in reserve, the 165th, and they would throw it against the Australians within 2 weeks, at a new location 4 kilometers to the north, a place called Fire Support Base Balmoral. On May 17th, General William Westmoreland, the commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, flew to Fire Support Base Coral by helicopter. He congratulated the task force on its successful defense. He inspected the positions. He spoke with the soldiers. And he understood that the Australians had fought with remarkable courage and effectiveness against overwhelming odds. Over the following week, Australian patrols continued to clash with enemy forces throughout the area of operations. Many of the contacts were with elements of the NEA 165th Regiment, which was believed to be withdrawing north into War Zone D. A Company 3RA occupied blocking positions along the Swy Bafo Creek and ambushed enemy groups moving through the area. On May 22nd, Fire Support Base Coral was attacked again. This time it was a short but accurate mortar bombardment. The Australian artillery and mortars responded immediately with counter-battery fire. The attack was broken up quickly. Expecting further heavy fighting, Brigadier Hughes requested armoured reinforcement. On May 23rd, 4 Centurion tanks from C Squadron 1st Armoured Regiment arrived at Coral after a tense road march from Nui Dat. The Centurions were powerful main battle tanks mounting 19mm guns and heavy machine guns. They had been used by the Australians in previous operations with devastating effect, and they were about to prove their worth again. On May 24, 3 RA redeployed to establish Fire Support Base Balmoral 4.5 kilometers north of Coral. D Company 3 RA with supporting elements dug in to defend the new base. The Centurion tanks, which had arrived at Coral just hours before, moved north to Balmoral to provide armoured support. The infantry and tank crews worked together to prepare defensive positions. Wire was strung immediately. Claymores were positioned. Fields of fire were cleared. Overhead protection was constructed. The defences were coordinated and mutually supporting, and they were completed before nightfall. The Australians were ready. And on the night of May 26, the North Vietnamese came. At 03:45, a rocket and mortar barrage hammered Balmoral, and then the NVA 165th Regiment attacked. 2 battalions, over 1,000 men. The assault fell primarily on D Company. Wave after wave of enemy soldiers advanced through the darkness toward the Australian positions, and the Centurion tanks opened fire. The 90mm main guns of the Centurions fired high explosive shells at point-blank range into the advancing enemy formations. Each explosion tore through ranks of soldiers. The 50-caliber machine guns on the tanks raked the assault waves with sustained fire. The Australian infantry added their own firepower, machine guns, rifle grenades, mortars, artillery. The combined effect was devastating. The North Vietnamese attack shattered. Bodies piled up in front of D Company's wire. 42 confirmed enemy dead were counted at first light. Many more were. The Australians had suffered 4 killed and 42 wounded, but the enemy had been stopped cold. The tanks had proven decisive. Their firepower and armoured protection allowed them to dominate the battlefield in a way that infantry alone could not. The North Vietnamese had never faced Australian Centurions in such numbers, and the experience was catastrophic for them. On May 27th, the Australians at Coral went on the offensive. A troop of Centurion tanks, supported by infantry, assaulted an enemy bunker complex that had been located just outside the fire support base. The bunkers were well constructed, heavily fortified. They had been used as a staging area for the attacks on Coral. The tanks and infantry destroyed the bunkers and their occupants methodically and without loss. It was a textbook combined arms operation. The tanks provided heavy firepower and protected the infantry from enemy fire. The infantry cleared the bunkers and protected the tanks from close assault. Together they were unstoppable. And on the night of May 28th, the North Vietnamese tried one final time to break through. At 02:30, the entire NVA 165th Regiment launched a regimental strength attack against Balmoral. It was the largest enemy assault of the entire battle. 2 battalions advanced through their own minefields directly into D Company 3 RA. The attack was supported by heavy mortar and rocket fire. But once again, the combined firepower of the tanks, artillery, and infantry broke the assault. The Centurions fired continuously. The 90mm guns roared. High explosive shells detonated among the attacking soldiers with terrible effect. The mortars and artillery added their weight of fire. The attack was called off after only 30 minutes. The North Vietnamese had suffered catastrophic casualties and achieved nothing. Their regiment was shattered. They withdrew into the jungle, leaving their dead behind. The battle continued into early June, but the intensity decreased rapidly. The North Vietnamese 7th Division had been badly mauled. They had lost hundreds of soldiers killed and many more wounded. Their offensive capability was gone. They needed time to regroup, to reinforce, to recover. Australian patrols continued throughout the area of operations, but contacts became less frequent. On June 6th, after 26 days of continuous operations, 1 ATF withdrew from fire support bases Coral and Balmoral and returned to their base at Nui Dat. They were relieved by American and South Vietnamese forces. The Battle of Coral-Balmoral was over. The final count was sobering. 26 Australian soldiers had been killed. Over 100 were wounded. 2 were from 12th Field Regiment, 1 from 104 Signals, 16 from 1 RAR, 6 from 3 RA, 1 from 161st Independent Reconnaissance Squadron. The cost had been high, but the enemy had paid a far higher price. Between 267 and 327 North Vietnamese were confirmed killed. 11 were captured. Hundreds of weapons were seized. The actual losses were certainly much higher. Blood trails, drag marks, and intelligence reports indicated that the NVA 7th Division had been devastated. But the significance of the Battle of Coral-Balmoral went far beyond the casualty figures. It was the largest unit-level action fought by Australian forces during the entire Vietnam War. It was the longest sustained combat operation. It was the bloodiest. And it was the first time the Australians had faced North Vietnamese Army regular units operating in regimental strength in conventional warfare. The battle proved several critical points. First, that Australian combined arms doctrine worked. The integration of infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and aviation into a cohesive fighting force capable of defeating a numerically superior enemy was demonstrated beyond question. Second, that firepower was decisive. The massed artillery fires, the Centurion tanks, the helicopter gunships, the close air support, all combined to create a killing zone that the enemy could not penetrate. Third, that the Centurion tank was highly effective in jungle warfare despite American doctrine which held that tanks were unsuitable for operations in dense terrain. The Australians proved otherwise. The tanks at Balmoral had been the difference between victory and defeat. Fourth, that the North Vietnamese army was capable of launching large-scale conventional attacks with discipline and courage even in the face of overwhelming firepower. The enemy at Coral-Balmoral had fought with determination and skill. They were not broken remnants. They were professional soldiers, and they had been willing to accept staggering casualties to achieve their objectives. The battle also revealed serious weaknesses in Australian planning and intelligence. The intelligence failure that led the battalion commanders to believe they were facing only scattered enemy groups when in fact they were landing on top of an enemy division headquarters was inexcusable. Men died because of that failure. The chaotic insertion on May 12th, the poor coordination between units, the incomplete defenses, the separation of the artillery batteries by 1,500 meters, all of these mistakes nearly resulted in disaster. The Australians had been saved by the courage and skill of individual soldiers, by superior firepower, and by luck. If the North Vietnamese had not fired a preparatory bombardment that alerted the defenders on the first night, if the Australian guns had not been laid by chance in the direction of the main assault, if the enemy had achieved complete surprise, fire support base Coral might have been overrun. The lessons were clear. Intelligence must be accurate and timely. Planning must be thorough. Coordination must be seamless. Defenses must be prepared before dark. And luck cannot be relied upon. For the North Vietnamese, the battle was a disaster. The 7th Division had been ordered to attack Saigon again in June as part of a third wave offensive, but after Coral-Balmoral they were incapable of offensive operations. They had lost too many men, too much equipment, too much momentum. The attack was postponed indefinitely. The Australian blocking operation had achieved its strategic objective. The enemy withdrawal routes from Saigon had been interdicted. The North Vietnamese had been forced to fight on Australian terms in a battle of attrition that they could not win. The PPVN units withdrew into Cambodia and War Zone D to refit and replace their losses. It would be months before they were combat effective again. The fighting at Coral-Balmoral had bought time. Time for the pacification programs in the villages. Time for the South Vietnamese forces to recover from Tet. Time for the Allies to consolidate their positions. Whether that time was used wisely is another question. But the Australians had done their job. They had stopped the North Vietnamese 7th Division cold. They had held their ground against overwhelming odds. They had fought with courage, determination, and professionalism. Today, the battle is considered one of the most significant actions of the Vietnam War. For Australians, it stands alongside Long Tan as a defining moment of their involvement in the conflict. But for many years, Coral-Balmoral was overshadowed by Long Tan in the public consciousness. Long Tan had been a single-day battle, a company-sized action that captured the imagination. Coral-Balmoral was a grinding, brutal 26-day slugging match that involved 2 battalions and supporting arms. It was larger, it was longer, it was costly, but it was more complex and harder to understand. There was no single no desperate last stand by one isolated company. Instead, it was a series of actions: attack, defense, patrol, ambush, artillery fire. Thank you for your support. Airstrikes, engineering, logistics, the full spectrum of military operations, and that complexity made it harder to tell the story. But the story deserves to be told, because the men who fought at Coral-Balmoral faced some of the most intense combat of the entire war. They endured 26 days of continuous operations in enemy territory with the constant threat of attack. They fought through exhaustion, fear, loss, and uncertainty. They saw their friends killed and wounded. They dug graves and filled They fired thousands of rounds of ammunition. They called in artillery danger close to their own positions. They held the line when it seemed impossible, and they won. The artillery gunners who fought hand-to-hand over the gun pits on the first night at Coral deserve particular recognition. These were not infantrymen trained for close combat. They were gunners, specialists, trained to operate complex weapon systems and deliver indirect fire support. But when the enemy overran their positions, they fought with grenades, rifles, pistols, and fists. They refused to abandon their guns. They refused to retreat. And they drove the enemy back through sheer determination. Lieutenant Ian Ahern, the gun position officer of 102 Battery, later wrote that the fighting was the most intense and terrifying experience of his life. Gunners manned their howitzers under direct enemy fire and continued to serve the guns even as North Vietnamese soldiers climbed onto the protective bunds around the emplacements. The decision by Lieutenant Tony Jensen to call fire onto his own mortar position was an act of cold-blooded calculation. He knew that some of his own men would die, but he also knew that if he did not call that fire mission, everyone would die. It was the hardest decision a young officer could make, and it was the right decision. The flechette darts from the recoilless rifles swept the mortar position and stopped the enemy breakthrough. Jensen survived, but 5 of his men did not. Their sacrifice saved the fire support base. The infantrymen who held the perimeter during the attacks on May 16th and 26 also displayed extraordinary courage. Lieutenant Neil Weeks and his platoon fought off a battalion-sized assault at Coral with determination and skill. Weeks reorganized his defenses under fire, called in close support, and held his ground. Private Richard Norden, who would later receive the Victoria Cross for Australia, fought with such bravery during the patrol actions on May 14th that his actions became legendary within one RA. The tank crews of C Squadron 1st Armoured Regiment provided the firepower that broke the enemy attacks at Balmoral. The Centurion tanks were maintained under difficult conditions, driven over rough terrain, and fought with devastating effectiveness. The crew worked in extreme heat inside the steel hulls. They loaded 90mm shells and fired continuously during the attacks. They provided close support to the infantry and protected them from enemy assault. Without the tanks, Balmoral might have been overrun. The engineers who cleared fields of fire, constructed bunkers, laid wire, and disposed of enemy ordnance did dangerous work under constant threat. The signalers who maintained communications between units enabled the coordination of fire support and maneuver. The medics who treated the wounded under fire saved lives. The helicopter pilots who flew resupply and casualty evacuation missions into fire support bases under enemy mortar and rocket attack displayed exceptional courage. Every element of 1ATF contributed to the victory. But the battle also left scars. 26 families received the news that their sons, husbands, fathers, brothers would not be coming home. Over 100 men were wounded, some with injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. And the psychological impact of 26 days of sustained combat was profound. Many of the veterans of Coral-Balmoral struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, hypervigilance, survivor's guilt, anger, depression. The Australian public did not understand what these men had endured. The anti-war movement was growing. Veterans returning from Vietnam were not welcomed as heroes. They were often ignored or even vilified. The soldiers who fought at Coral-Balmoral came home to a country that did not want to hear their story. It would take decades before their service was properly recognized, before memorials were built and ceremonies were held. But the veterans themselves never forget. They formed associations. They gathered on anniversaries. They honored their fallen comrades. They told their stories to each other because no one else wanted to listen. And slowly, over the years, the significance of the Battle of Coral-Balmoral began to be understood. In 2008, 40 years after the battle, a major commemorative service was held. Veterans from 1RA, 3RA, 12th Field Regiment, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, 1st Armored Regiment, and supporting units gathered to remember. Lieutenant General Philip Bennett, who had commanded 1RA during the battle, spoke. Brigadier Jim Shelton, who had commanded 3RA, spoke. They honored the dead. They honored the wounded. They honored all who served, and they ensured that the story would not be forgotten. Because the Battle of Coral-Balmoral is more than just a military engagement. It is a story of courage under fire. It is a story of men pushed to their limits and refusing to break. It is a story of sacrifice and loss. It is a story of leadership and determination. It is a story that every Australian should know, because those men fought for their country. They did what they asked. They served with honor, and they paid a terrible price. The tactical lessons of Coral-Balmoral were studied by military professionals around the world. The effectiveness of combined artillery fire and stopping massed infantry assaults was demonstrated conclusively. The value of armored support in defensive operations was proven. The importance of proper reconnaissance and intelligence was reinforced. The need for coordinated defensive planning was made painfully clear. But beyond the tactical lessons, the battle showed something else. It showed that a small, professional, well-trained force can defeat a much larger enemy if it has superior firepower, effective leadership, and the will to fight. The Australians at Coral-Balmoral were outnumbered. They were operating far from their base in unfamiliar terrain. They were under constant threat of attack. But they prevailed, not because they were superhuman, not because the enemy was incompetent, but because they were better trained, better equipped, better led, and more determined. The North Vietnamese army fought with courage and skill. They launched mass assaults against prepared positions knowing they would suffer heavy casualties. They continued attacking even after their initial assaults were repulsed. They demonstrated discipline and determination. But in the end, firepower and combined arms warfare defeated courage and determination. That is the brutal mathematics of modern war. 56 years have passed since the Battle of Coral-Balmoral. Most of the men who fought there are now in their 70s and 80s. Some have passed away, but their story endures, and it must be told to new generations, because the lessons of Coral-Balmoral are timeless. The importance of accurate intelligence, the necessity of thorough planning, the value of combined arms operation, the decisiveness of firepower, the courage of individual soldiers, the cost of war. These lessons are as relevant today as they were in 1968. The Australian Defence Force continues to study the battle. Officer cadets at Duntroon learn about the command decisions made by Bennett and Shelton. Gunners study fire support coordination at Coral. Armored Corps officers study tank actions at Balmoral. Infantry officers study defensive tactics and patrol operations. The battle has become a case study in how to fight and win against a determined enemy. But we must also remember what was lost. 26 young Australians died at Coral-Balmoral. They died far from home in a war that many Australians did not understand or support. They died doing their duty, following orders, fighting for their mates. They died in the mud and blood of fire support-based Coral. They died in the rubber plantations around Balmoral. They died in patrol actions and ambushes and artillery bombardments. They alone or surrounded by comrades. But they all died, and their families were left to grieve, to wonder, to ask why. War always asks why, and the answers are never. We can honor their sacrifice. We can remember their names. We can ensure their story is told, but we cannot bring them back. We cannot undo the pain their families endured. We cannot erase the scars left on the survivors. All we can do is remember and learn and ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain. The Battle of Coral-Balmoral stands as a testament to the courage and professionalism of the Australian soldier. It shows what can be achieved when men are properly trained, properly equipped, and properly led. It shows the cost of war, the reality of combat, the brutality of battle. It shows that victory is not clean or easy or glorious. Victory is bloody, exhausting, traumatic. But sometimes it is necessary. The men who fought at Coral-Balmoral believed they were fighting to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. They believed they were supporting an ally. They believed they were doing their duty. History has judged the Vietnam War harshly. The strategic objectives were. The war was ultimately lost. The sacrifices made by Australian soldiers did not change the final outcome. But that does not diminish what those men did. They fought with honor. They did their duty. They held their ground, but they stopped the North Vietnamese 7th Division for 26 bloody days. And that is something that should never be forgotten. So if you learned something from this story, if you gained a deeper understanding of the Battle of Coral-Balmoral, if you appreciate the courage and sacrifice of the Australian soldiers who fought there, then hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Vietnam War records. Because there are more stories to tell, more battles to remember, more heroes to honor. The Vietnam War was a complex, controversial, tragic conflict. But within that conflict were moments of extraordinary courage, acts of selfless bravery, stories of men pushed to their limits. Those stories deserve to be told. Those men deserve to be remembered. Share this video, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. And remember, freedom is not free. It is paid for in blood. The men who fought at Coral-Balmoral paid that price. We owe them our respect. We owe them our gratitude. We owe them our memory. Let's forget